Hello, everyone. We're having a quick technical difficulty. If you'll spare with us for one moment, we'll get started in just a minute.
Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Imagining Our Future, the Essential Role of Climate Fiction and Nonfiction in Shaping Middle Grade Minds. I'm Sarah Hunter, editor for the Books for Youth and Graphic Novel sections at Booklist. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical details. The audience is in listen-only mode, but we welcome any questions you may have. On the bottom of your screen is a toolbar with a button for Q&A. If you have a question or need technical assistance, simply click Q&A and type your message into the box that appears. We will do our best to respond to all tech-related questions, and we'll pass along all other questions to today's panelists so they can follow up with you after the webinar. Booklist offers closed captioning on all webinars. To enable or disable captions on your screen, please look for and click the Captions icon on the toolbar mentioned earlier. From there, you can select Show or Hide Captions from the menu that appears. If you choose to enable subtitles, you can adjust the size of the captions at any time by selecting Caption Settings. And finally, Booklist expects all participants to maintain an atmosphere of respect and fairness. Anyone who violates this standard of behavior, including engaging in any form of harassment, may, at the discretion of the organizers, be immediately removed. We have a wonderful panel for you today, so let's start by meeting our panel. Mikaela Loach, named by Forbes, BBC Women's Hour, and The Guardian as one of the most influential women in the UK climate movement, is a British Jamaican former medical student, climate justice organizer, and director of the AWETHU School of Organizing. Her first book, It's Not That Radical, Climate Action to Transform Our World, was an instant indie bestseller. She was named the 2023 Nonfiction Indie Champion by Bookshop.org and one of the world's top thinkers by Prospect magazine. Mikaela has boldly challenged powerful entities, calling out billionaires at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's annual event, taking the UK government to court in the landmark Paid to Pollute case in 2021, and challenging Shell's CEO and board at their AGM for their human rights abuses to the people of the Niger Delta in Nigeria. Next, we have María José Fitzgerald, who's a teacher and children's author. Her favorite stories usually include animals, friendship, family, and magic. She grew up snorkeling and hiking in her homeland of Honduras, where nature and culture nourished her soul. Her debut novel, Turtles of the Midnight Moon, won the Green Earth Book Award and was named a Bank Street Best Book of the Year, among other honors. When she's not writing, you can find her reading, walking her dogs, or maybe out on a family motorcycle. Lynne Kelly is the award-winning USA Today bestselling author of Song for a Whale and The Secret Language of Birds. Lynne lives near Houston, Texas, with her dogs, Abigail and Eloise. Nicholas Day is the author of The Mona Lisa Vanishes, winner of the Robert F. Sybert Award and the Boston Globe Horn Book Award for Nonfiction. He is also the author of the picture book Nothing, which received 3-star reviews, and the adult narrative nonfiction title Baby Meets World. He has written regularly for Slate. His work has also appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, and The Washington Post, among their publications. He lives in Western Massachusetts with his family. Welcome, everyone. So good to see you. So I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to describe your book that we'll be talking about today, and we'll just go in the order of your introductions. So, Mikaela, if you could go first.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to Booklist for this event and to every other author who's here. I'm very excited for this conversation. So my book is Climate is Just the Start. It's just behind that shoulder. And it is really about how kids have such big feelings and such huge and expansive imaginations for like being able to create entire worlds in their head and play with dinosaurs and fairies and princesses and whatever else they want to create. And that those big feelings and those big imaginations are actually so essential to tackling the climate crisis. The world that we live in today is quite literally just the manifestation of the imaginations of many people who were many, many, many years ago, and they're kind of upheld and continued by those imaginations being believed in and made real. And those make systems like white supremacy, they make things like this idea that we need fossil fuels to continue. And we can also exercise our imaginations to create better worlds, to create something that's transformed and liberated and free. And kids want that. They see there's so much about this world that doesn't make sense. And so the book is basically about how climate is just the start of our issues, but also about how climate is just the start of all the things that we can change in our world and that we can transform, and that there's so much hope that we can get from all of that.
Thank you. Wonderful. Maria, how about you?
I love that, Mikaela. I cannot wait to read your book. Yeah, my novel is Turtles of the Midnight Moon. And unlike Mikaela's, this is fiction. So it follows Barana and Abby, two girls who are trying to solve a sea turtle egg poaching mystery in Honduras, on the coast of Honduras, which is where I grew up. And it's an eco mystery. And I think some of the themes are having compassion for all living things and each other and friendship and hope. And yeah, that's my book.
Thank you. Lynne, you're next.
And it's an excellent book too. So another work of fiction. My upcoming book, Three Blue Hearts, will be out in October. And this one is about just a kind, compassionate boy named Max who has had his most embarrassing moments, a large audience, and is a kid who loves books, loves animals. His dad is none of that. So he doesn't feel like the things that he loves are really valued, and there are so many expectations he will be more like his dad. This vacation or this summer away from home on this beach town in Texas with his mom is a welcome vacation away from all of that, all those expectations. A storm when they arrive, so not a great start to the summer, but then he finds an injured octopus on the sand and is thinking maybe he's finally in the right place at the right time. Doesn't know what to do, but he can't walk away, so he will do what he can to get some help for this octopus, and then is able to help care for her throughout the summer with some help of some wonderful new friends that he meets there.
Thank you. And Nicholas, tell us about your book.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great getting to hear about everyone's books. So my book is called A World Without Summer, and it's a nonfiction story. And it starts with the eruption of the volcano Tambora, which is in Indonesia, about 200 years ago. And it's a massive eruption. It's the largest eruption since the last ice age. And what it creates over the course of the next couple of years is a sort of climate shock that sort of turns the world upside down and upends people's expectations for how the world is supposed to work, for when the sun is supposed to shine, for when rain is supposed to fall. And in a very short period of time, all of those assumptions are sort of, thrown out the window. And it tells that story alongside the story of a young Mary Shelley who is writing Frankenstein inside a villa in Switzerland, which is having the worst summer in its history. And Frankenstein is, of course, a story about a scientist who thinks that he is doing wonderful things for the world, and ends up having to chase down this creature that he's created, and it's too late. And so it's a way of talking about a climate shock that is in the past, and that we can kind of look at it and see how dramatic it was and see what people did.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we have two nonfiction authors and two fiction authors, but I'm going to resist the dichotomy because, as we all know, nonfiction and fiction go hand in hand. So for the nonfiction authors, I'm hoping you can tell me a little bit about how fiction has helped shape your personal understanding of climate change. Mikaela, can we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I love fiction. I also really love YA, and growing up, I think how I first started to understand the structures of the world was actually from reading The Hunger Games. So not just about this. I think a lot of people saw those books as being, just about the games themselves, but I think what I gained as a kid was about the structure of the world. So the way that that world is structured in the districts all supply something that's necessary to a capital where there's the consolidation of wealth, and how those districts revolt is by like withdrawing their labor and preventing those resources from reaching this like consolidation of wealth in the center. Really taught me about like imperialism in our real world, and how that works, and then also about how do we resist, and about different kind of political ideologies, and different ideas of how do we solve these issues, that through that book is kind of represented by her two love interests, who are kind of representing two different ideologies of how to tackle issues. So I think fiction can open up our brains so much, because so much imagination is necessary in order to engage with it. And I think there's so much that we can also gain from that process of exercising that imagination. If I can believe that I live in that world, I can also believe that I live in a better, transformed, liberated world, and I can think of ways to get there. And for me, at least, like both as a kid and as an adult, like it's speculative fiction, like fiction that asks a question, is really what has done that for me. And I think it's really important. So I'm really glad that we have a non-fiction and fiction conversation happening here. As writers, we're not separate from the world, like we're enmeshment with it. So whether we're writing fiction or we're writing non-fiction, our words are based in a level of reality in some way, and then learning from it and questioning it.
Nicholas, how about you? How has fiction informed your understanding of climate change?
Well, I suppose I'd like to second all of that, and maybe add in my meager way that I think, and I suspect I'm not alone here, that the novel that has kind of most influenced my thinking about climate change is Kim Stanley Robinson's great novel, Mystery of the Future. And that is a book that is, I think, a very accessible book. It's a book for adults, but it's a book that teens, I think, would really enjoy. And it's a devastating book with kind of a kernel of hope at its center. And one of the magisterial things about it is the way it addresses this very complicated sort of tightrope walk people do and people have to manage when they write about climate change, which is that we're taking stuff that is very real and stuff that's happening now, and then we're sort of springboarding off from that. And so it's this combination of sort of the real and the unreal, and the way they're intermeshed. It's very complicated and it's very tricky to do. And luckily I don't have to do that, so I get off very easy. But that is the thing that is the book that I think has sort of allowed me to sort of put aside my assumptions about how things might work, what the sort of structures are that allow certain possibilities of action now, and allowed me to sort of imagine more widely and think more widely about what a different way of sort of addressing these issues might look like.
Excellent. Okay, to my fiction authors, how has nonfiction shaped your understanding? Lynne, can we start with you?
Oh, sure. Yeah, and I think for both of us, even though we are writing stories that we make up, these are fictionalized stories, but they are meant to be realistic. And we want people who read them to be in the story, absorbed in the story, and not stop if we say something that's incorrect. So say about turtles or, whales or octopuses or whatever it is, because someone reading it will know more than we do. So we have to do a lot of research in writing these contemporary fiction stories, or probably any writer of fiction has to do their research. So I want the realistic things to seem realistic, and I want to know about these animals I'm writing about these settings, so that the reader is absorbed in the story. And so I love reading these fascinating works of nonfiction to inform my research. And then I always learn something too, even if I'm doesn't matter that it's a book written for kids or young adults. I pick up a new to me nonfiction topic, and I love learning about that. And that's a wonderful thing about being a writer too. We're always learning new things, and we can take anything we're curious about and create a story about that.
Maria, how about you?
Yeah, that's so true. I think for me as a fiction writer, I'm also like a nerd at heart. So I love doing research and I love diving into topics that interest me. And, one thing, like when I was doing research for Turtles of the Midnight Moon, obviously you can get really deep into sea turtle conservation research, organizations that are doing a lot of hard work, a lot of good work. And one thing that when I read this question, you sent us the questions earlier, I sort of went back to when I was a college student. I studied ecology with an emphasis in marine science. And back then in my early 20s, I didn't think I was going to be a children's writer, but I always loved stories. I always loved fiction. I always loved poetry. So it's interesting that I was studying something science-y, and I loved reading like journals that our professors would give us to read for class, because headlines tend to be very like, negative and inflammatory, and they can cause a lot of anxiety about climate change and about endangered species and what's happening to our planet and to our biodiversity. And reading some of these journals and nonfiction books as well, it actually gave me hope, because I saw people doing the work, and human beings are pretty phenomenal in their creativity and in their problem solving. So even though I write fiction and I'm trying to sort of shape the minds of these kids that read our books to feel that sense of like, we've got this, like we can take action in our communities, we can do this. Nonfiction can offer that, so it's had a huge impact. And sometimes I procrastinate doing too much research, and then I'm like, okay, get to the plot, get to the character backstory. But I think they really do go hand in hand.
Yeah, I'm struck by what you're saying about feelings, because Mikaela, you speak to that directly in your book when you're talking about giving space to emotion when you're encountering the troubles of the world. And that really feels like, in a lot of ways, the kind of domain of fiction. Fiction is speaking to feelings in so many circumstances. And I wonder if that experience of reading fiction and having that direct appeal to emotion impacts an understanding of a nonfiction perspective on the world as well, to put it in clumsy terms.
No, not that's incredibly like eloquent. So and a really like interesting perspective. I think there's a lot of us, I think, read fiction books sometimes because we want to cry. Like I think about how often I'm like, I have some emotions in me and I'm like, I need to find a book that I can cry all of those out. And I think it's because like these different worlds, I think in some ways can sometimes be like a rehearsal of us understanding and processing things that we're going to experience, that we do experience in our world, but that we maybe ourselves can't in that moment put words to, but someone else has. And that can both be in fiction, but also in nonfiction. I think of how when I read like Audre Lorde's collections of letters, and I feel like I'm immersed in her world and I can understand, and that she's experienced so many things before me, and makes me feel so much less lonely because I'm not the first to challenge these things or to care about these things. And in a similar way, like, yeah, I read Octavia E. Butler's work, like The Parable of the Sower, about this future of climate breakdown, and that feels in some way like a rehearsal of what might be to come for us, and that through processing those emotions through that character, we can gain, I think, as well, like some sort of peace, or also like some sort of understanding. Because I mean, at the moment, if I'm being like quite honest, I've been processing a lot of climate grief, like a huge wave of it. I spent the last week at a climate conference, a UN climate conference that sadly yet again failed us completely. And I've had to spend many days since that just sitting with that grief and processing it. And actually, I had to remind myself of my own words in Climate is Just the Start, about how the first introduction is about like you can't change the world without your feelings. And I was really grateful that I almost had that to remind myself of I have to live by my own words, and so I can't push this down. I have to channel it, and I have to sit with it, and I have to allow it to be. And it made me also really grateful that throughout the book, I had check-ins for the kids who are reading it of like, how are you feeling right now? Like, can we sit with that? Like, can we name our feelings? And then can we do something with them rather than telling ourselves that they're not okay or that they're too big? So yeah, I think both nonfiction and fiction can allow us to process things in like really important ways.
So speaking of nonfiction again, as you mentioned, you've all done research for your book, sure. And I'm curious if you can each tell me something surprising that you learned in the research process for each of your books. Nicholas, I am really thinking of your book a lot just because your project just spread so far globally into so many different arenas. And I'm wondering if there was anything particularly striking that you encountered when you were researching them.
Right. Well, Yeah, there's a wheelbarrow's worth, right? I think what I would come back to is that we live in this weird moment where scientists talk about this in terms of shifting baselines, where we sort of acquaint ourselves with one sort of situation and then it slowly changes and we acquaint ourselves with this new situation. And humans are generally sort of not particularly good at reacting to slow change in that way. Um, and that's one of the things that we're all grappling with when we think about the failures of international bodies to come to agreements. But one of the things that happens in my book is it's a very, very rapid change. Um, and so we see people without time to accustom themselves to this new reality. And so within like a year, um, people are out in the streets, people are on their knees thinking they're, living at the beginning of the biblical apocalypse. Um, People are following prophets who are talking about how the world is going to end. Um, People are storming the town halls. They're taking the grain. They're going out into the fields at night. They're stripping the fields. Um, this was a world that, this is the early 19th century. The Napoleonic Wars have just ended. Um, and so in many ways, Europe in particular has had 20 years of catastrophe. And it's coming out of it and it's looking forward to this new brighter time. Um, and then all of a sudden, within 12 months or so, the world is spun back into this sort of nightmare dystopian scenario. And to me, even though we are all kind of grappling with this now, to see how fast things can shift um, and how much we take for granted without realizing that we're taking it for granted. Um, these are things that I think were really, really starkly sort of evident when I was doing the research.
Yeah. Maria, how about you? What are some of the fascinating things you learned when you were researching for your?
Sure. So I just want to say for what Nicholas was saying, that I think it's so interesting to think about rapid change and how we're as humans so quick to respond to a catastrophe versus slow, the frog in the slowly boiling water. It's so true. So in Turtles of the Midnight Moon, I do have like a big event, which is this hurricane that kind of disrupts there's erosion and the turtle eggs, the nests are going to be washed away. And everybody kind of takes action quickly. But then there's also the slower effects of climate change that the people in the community are grappling with. But I'll go back to your question now. Research. I think, I had to go back to my notes and try to remember some of the things I learned because it was a while ago that I did all the research. And I've been researching something else since. So I was like, okay, what were some fascinating things? One thing that I remember learning was that, and I kind of knew this already, but then rereading it and learning more about it was one of the slow climate change impacts on sea turtle populations in particular is that the rising temperatures, right? There's this fine line. We think, oh, it's going up a degree or half a degree or something, but these slow rising temperatures have a huge impact on reptiles and sea turtles specifically in the ratio of the sex of the sea turtle eggs. So rising temperatures, you get a higher ratio of female eggs. And over time, that can have a really huge impact on the population if there aren't enough males. So that was one thing that was really interesting. The other thing that I had no idea about this was that leatherback sea turtles, which most people are not very familiar with leatherbacks because when you think of a sea turtle, you think of like the hawksbill or the green and with like the hard shell and they're really beautiful. Leatherbacks are, to me, the most fascinating. I did not know that they can regulate their temperature. Unlike most reptiles, they actually have different adaptations to regulate their temperature. So they're not cold-blooded, they're warm-blooded. So I thought that was interesting.
Mikaela, how about you, Brenda? Tell me about something surprising you.
Sorry, did you ask me?
Hmm.
Yeah, okay. I think something that was surprising that's actually well that I included in climate just at the start, but it was more for the research for my first book. It's not that radical. Was I remember the first time when I found out that the kind of idea of the climate footprint, which is something that's very normalized in a lot of spaces. I remember when I was a kid, like we at school, we drew around our foot and then we had to write what are the things that contribute to that. I'm not sure if they still do that at schools today. But that idea was popularized by BP, who are an oil company. So like if a massive fossil fuel company that are causing the climate crisis, they're like in the top 20 companies responsible for a third of greenhouse gas emissions in the like industrial era. They're in the 100 companies responsible for 1% of emissions. Like I think they're number 6 on that list as well. So they are big time responsible. If they want us to focus on our personal and individual impact, we have to ask if that's actually going to tackle this crisis or if that's actually a distraction tactic. So if all of us are, so focused on our footprint and not thinking about the fact that these companies are spending billions on lobbying so that we are like locked into fossil fuel infrastructure for so much longer, so the transition is delayed, then they'll get away with it. And so I think that it was I think a lot of people find that quite surprising because it seems like it's a good thing, but that kind of loops into a lot of the discussions in the book on like greenwashing and how things that might seem good for the planet are sometimes used to kind of maintain the existence of these industries for so much longer. So they're kind of like camouflage in a way of a way these industries can disguise what they're doing. And so that was something that I think is quite surprising. But also, so near the end of the book, it felt really important for me to share examples and stories of how kids have been involved in creating transformational change for such a long time, and they are presently. And one of the key stories that I wanted to share was of the children's crusades that happened in the US during the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and how all of these kids left from school, faced huge amounts of violence, but kept marching arm in arm, even as they were these black kids who were being attacked by police dogs and water hoses. But what I found really interesting about that is how organized they were, like how they and also how young the people who were actually the kids involved in this are today. So they are not like very old people. This is not in the like far off past that this happened. These people are like maybe people's grandparents, but not even very old grandparents. And how they planned it was that the kids would listen to the radio every day, and they knew that if the radio person said like, we're gonna have a party in the park, that meant that like we're gonna do it today. We're gonna all walk out of school together. And how they'd say something about like, oh, make sure you've got your toothbrush this morning, and that meant like we might be staying overnight because and how organized these kids were, I thought was so like amazing, especially like in a time where there wasn't social media and things that people feel very reliant on, I think, to make things happen right now. So I thought that was really like exciting as well. Obviously, completely harrowing to read about that history, but also I think an encouragement of like how the Fridays for Future strikes from school today are kind of like a historical echo of those strikes that happened like decades before, and how we'll have so much more transformation like led by kids in the future and in the present.
Lynne, what do you learn about octopuses?
Yeah, pick up a book or an article about an octopus and you're going to learn something fascinating. So this was really fun research to do. So I wouldn't, because this kid is, taking the octopus to a wildlife center and people who know what to do. And I needed to know what would likely happen. How would they care for this animal? But so fascinating and so intelligent. They do have 3 hearts. They have blue blood. Their brain is sort of like a star shape, so that each arm sort of has its own brain, so they can operate independently, which would be nice. You can get so much done if you're a multitasker. And what else about the setting too? Even though the setting is fictitious, but it's made up of different Texas coastal towns into one, largely based on Indianola, which you might not have heard of because it's pretty much a ghost town now and has been for a long time. But they were pummeled by 2 huge hurricanes in the late 1800s. And then a fire. And then finally the people there said, this is obviously not a place to live. So let's, we're going to abandon this place. So it is still abandoned. But I saw too that their old courthouse is still, I think it's something like 100 yards into the water, that you can see the foundation of the courthouse. So it changed the landscape that much. So there's really nothing else there. So but I took that and sort of reimagined, what if they did come back? What if people still did, end up, building up and didn't get wrecked by yet another hurricane? So I have like largely that, and then other, towns like Galveston and some others that make up this setting. So that was interesting to see what the effects of this, these weather events on this place. And that I love abandoned spaces too. So it was fun to research that in addition to researching octopuses, and to see that there are remnants of this old downtown still out there in the water.
Cool. So we've been talking about so many different aspects of climate change, and that is just an illustration of how complex and global and interconnected the entire issue is. And it's vast even for adults to try to comprehend. So I'm curious about how you approach helping younger readers, especially readers in like elementary and middle school and the beginning of high school, really grasp how it works, what it means, and what's going on. Maria, can we start with you on this one?
Sure. I think for, when your audience is 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old, 13-year-old kids, I think you want to offer them, yes, information about what's going on, and have some takeaways, right, from the story, because we do have something that we're trying to get across. We have something we're trying to say in our fiction, in our stories, and yet we're storytellers. So I'm thinking of my characters and their arc, and like, what is it that they're having to resolve within themselves by the end of the story. I think to make it accessible, for me, I like to sort of hone in on one issue, and yes, touch on others. So for example, the issue I was touching on was sea turtle conservation, climate change, sort of narrowed down to that. But one of the main characters' brother can't stand plastic pollution, and he's like a B-plot character, and he does a lot of art from trash and from recycled materials. I think trying to narrow it down to actionable things for kids to say, okay, like in my community, this is what I see. These are the people I can rely on. These are the organizations that I could get involved with. Doing that so that they don't feel super overwhelmed by the bigger picture. So yeah, it's sort of this narrowing down maybe, and making it feel like they can relate to these characters, giving these characters real, middle grade issues, friendship issues, and issues with their mom or their dad, and that kind of thing, to make it all more relatable so that they're in the story. And yes, they're learning, and there's hope, and they can follow the mystery and try to figure out whodunit, but at the same time feeling like, okay, this is something I could also see myself doing in my own community, taking action in some way.
Mm-hmm. Mikaela, how about you? What's your approach?
I think I was quite lucky in the sense that I do a lot of work with schools. With kids that are like 8 to 11 are actually my like favorite age group of kids to work with, because they care so much. They have such huge hearts, and they really I go into schools and I do this thing where I get them to draw this Venn diagram, and they write down and it's something that's near the end of the book of what do they care about and what are they good at, and etc. And then they work out what's their role in the movement. And when you ask these kids what they care about, they're like, my cat, like that's what I care about so much. And so they're like, I want to do something. And then you work out that maybe they could, they all love art as well. So how could you use art and your cat to find your role in the movement? And we're making posters about endangered cats. And it's just like, there's also so much silliness that I love that like kids of that age have. And so I think I was very lucky that I got to kind of try out a lot of things I wanted to write in the book and work out, does this land, in the sense that do they understand what I'm talking about? does this analogy make the most sense? Is this story the best way to tell it that they're engaged with by the work that I do in schools already? And then also I was very lucky that one school in London, I think in the US it'd be an elementary school, but it's a primary school. They have a classroom that's named after me, so it's the Loach class. And so I got to go in a few times with them and read bits of the book and also check things out with. And they got to be included in the book as well, which I then surprised them on publication day by getting them to read out parts of the book to the class. And when they got to the bit where it said the Loach class, they were gasped and really excited. But it was just, I think it was really, I felt very like blessed that I was able to have people of that age who I could try things on and see. And they really encouraged me to include things like analogies that mention poop, because apparently that's the most engaging thing you can say to kids of that age. And if you can make things a bit silly and fun, I think that's really good. And tell stories, because I think the things that people remember are stories. And this is something that I think about in the climate communications that I do anywhere, like whether I'm on the news talking or something as well. If you can say a story that's engaging, that tells that issue, it's going to stay with someone so much longer than just telling them what's happening in the world or giving them statistics. So they reminded me of stories to include, and yeah, so I felt very like lucky to have those available to me and those experiences.
Nicholas, can you tell us about how you approach such a big topic?
Well, I can try to weasel out of answering the question. I think I would just, add on to what Maria was saying, that, that the most important thing, or your primary responsibility, is to be inside the story and carry people with you in the story. And without that connection, any other work that you might want to do, any other things you might think are important, any information you want to convey, none of that is going to happen. And also, they're not going to make it past page 10 anyway, right? And so, for nonfiction, especially for nonfiction that takes place a couple of hundred years ago, it can be a little trickier to sort of tackle the complexity of this sort of issue, because I'm limited to the facts. I'm limited to the story that was taking place then. But I think what A World Without Summer does, hopefully, point out is something that sometimes tends to get lost weirdly in climate change discussions, which is that you'll often see news articles pointing out that, like, oh, this particular island is threatened, or this particular city is supposed to, have, its summers in August will be much, much worse than this city here. And this idea of sort of climate safe zones, where some cities are, better places to be. And what tends to get obscured a little bit is the sort of startlingly obvious elemental fact that, there is only one Earth and we're not getting another one. And so, because A World Without Summer is, it's an atmospheric event. It's a purely global event. And so I think the interconnectedness of all of this, really, like, the facts of the story really highlight how there isn't really an escape hatch.
And Lynne, tell us about how you approach it.
Well, yeah, I was thinking too, like, especially like Mikaela had said, this is the power of stories, right? People connect to stories. And I'm not separating, fiction and nonfiction here. These nonfiction writers know that, they could hand someone a book full of numbers and statistics about what the effects of climate change are, and nobody's going to read more than a couple of pages of that, if at all. But we are wired to connect to stories, and that's going to be more memorable. So we tell these stories about what happens or what has happened. People have been conveying information through story since long before there was written language. People would pass along information, cautionary tales, lessons, etc., by storytelling, because that's what will stick with you. We will remember that. And it can be daunting, of course, for our kids, or for anyone who's, say, watching the news cycle in any day now. It's so daunting to think, what do I do? There's so much. And you can feel so helpless looking at that. But if we see through these stories how it affects your community. So it's too daunting to look at the whole world. What do I do? I can't fix that. What can you do in your community though? So we can see that through what our characters do or through these other stories we see about the impacts of climate change in different communities, what's happened and what people are doing to mitigate that. So they can see, okay, here's what someone did in their family, their school, their beach, their town. Here's someone they helped. Here's something maybe I could do too, even if they're not going to go through the same thing our characters did, but they can still relate to that and they can connect to that, and maybe they'll experience something like that in a smaller way, and they'll think about what the impact could be then. So I think all of us who are telling stories, however we do that, that's what it offers to our reading audience. There's that connection, and they can see what these characters did and think through how they might tackle an obstacle in a similar way, what they might do if they encounter something, some kind of problem that comes up. So it helps us to connect to our community and to each other, and to think through these problems in a way through our characters.
Yeah, and the thing I felt so strongly about your book, Lynn, was all it took for Max to get involved in his community was making one connection with one octopus. And that moment of like care and concern sort of expanded outward to where he became invested in this rehabilitation center for animals, and he made friends and he cared about the community itself, just starting with that one small moment where he chose to make a caring choice. And I thought that was really nicely captured in your book, that one act can start many, many more acts. And I think that's a useful lesson for especially middle graders to take away as they're reading any book, really.
Well, thanks so much. You know, one of those things that might seem insignificant, but then it does end up making a big difference. So we might encounter those any day, all day long. So we can watch for those moments when we can make the right choice and make someone else's life better and make this place better.
Mm-hmm. So climate justice is a common theme across all of your books, both explicitly and more subtly. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the importance of incorporating that conversation in discussions of climate change writ large. Maria, I was thinking about your book a lot for this one, actually, because I know, Mikaela, you talk about it very explicitly, but Maria, one of the things that I noticed in your book was the issue of the insustainability of the diving industry in the town in Honduras, and how poverty affected the needs of all the people in that community, and led to them making difficult choices about how they would make money for themselves. And you don't really dwell on that very much, but it's very much in the background. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what led you to choose to incorporate that plot thread in the novel.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not the A plot, but it's there the whole way through. And I think for me, you know, growing up back home and witnessing firsthand through my local community and visiting the coastal areas, the people on the front lines of climate change, especially those living on the coast, in the coast, along the coast, whose livelihoods rely on the ocean and marine life, and they are the most impacted by the actions of those of us living, you know, in places where we don't really feel these issues as much. They're feeling it, you know, and I really wanted to include that in the story because, you know, even though, you know, Abby being from New Jersey, where I currently live, and having this sort of behind the camera perspective, right? She has this wildlife photography passion, and she's coming into this world, and she meets Barana, who's there, who lives there, who works with the local sea turtle conservation. You see that perspective of the outsider coming in, and then her coming out from behind the lens. But then for Barana, who's actually there and can feel the impacts more directly, and her mentor, who, without giving anything away, I mean, you're exactly right. When people, you know, that tightrope that Nicholas was talking about, you know, when you have to make a choice for your family and your livelihood, but something great for the environment or for a particular species. This is where we see a lot of issues with wildlife trafficking and egg poaching and even pollution, and then overfishing. And with the lobster industry, I brought that in because it's all interconnected. One thing in my story, I was trying to weave together all these different real issues in a way that kids can be like, oh my gosh, like these divers going down there for lobsters and they're dying. That has nothing to do with the main plot, but it's there because, again, it's the thing with climate change and action and our role in this is that there are so many threads that you start pulling on one, it's going to connect to another. And poverty and climate change, they go hand in hand. And a lot of the people on the front lines are Indigenous women in my country, women. Maria, the lady who runs the organization back in Pattaya, my fictional coastal town, which is also like Lynn, based on a few different coastal towns that I grew up visiting. My grandmother was from the coast. She is very much, for me, a representation of so many women in Honduras who are leading the fight. Yeah.
Mikaela, I see you nodding so much as Maria is talking, and it's making me remember a line from your book, which is, if you can't afford it, is it really a choice? And that really encapsulates for me how poverty and climate justice is really like embedded in this larger conversation, like personal responsibility versus like global decision making. I wonder if you could speak on that a little bit.
No, I've been sat here going, like nodding throughout Maria speaking, and I'm really, really excited to read your book. It sounds brilliant. Sorry, I'm a bit lost in the brain of thinking how brilliant Maria's book is, so I need to collect my own thoughts. But yeah, I think that this conversation around like what is really a choice and what agency do we really have is really, really important and doesn't get talked about, I think, enough often in climate spaces. It's almost as if like people are making bad choices for the planet, as in the average person, when actually for a lot of people and for the majority of people, these like so-called bad choices, especially the most impactful ones on the climate, aren't really choices. I mean, so if I think about the UK, where I live, like we have like the leakiest housing stock in Europe. So our houses are so badly insulated. So the majority of household emissions that are like causing the climate crisis for people here is the fact that their home is not insulated properly. And so many more emissions are being needed through like to heat your home and for energy. But most people don't have a choice over that because they're living in rented accommodation. They don't have control over whether their house is insulated or not. Or they just simply like can't afford to retrofit their house and take it completely off gas and fossil fuels and insulate it properly. Whereas like governments do have choices around that, and there are choices that have been made to lock us into fossil fuel infrastructure for longer, and those choices are being made by like a really small percentage of our population, like the kind of ultra rich and the CEOs of these companies, who spend so much on like lobbying power as well, that is partly obviously used to prevent policy that would allow for a transition, but also partly used to make people feel like it's their fault, like everything is your fault. If you don't have enough money to feed your kids, that's your fault. It's not the fault of the like business that you work for that have blocked unions, or not the fault of policy that has prevented you from having like an adequate like infrastructure or healthcare or things like that that you need to be able to live. And I think this idea of like individualized responsibility and this burden actually disempowers a lot of people from taking action. And so it felt really important in the book to give kids that perspective of like outside of just this idea of bad choices, but also the choices that we can make outside of lifestyle ones, are also ones of coming together in our community to take action to try and change things that would move it from like sustainability for me as the individual and into like how can my community be safer and how can my community be more sustainable. And like I think that we can feel so much more empowered by that rather than this feeling of like dread and doom that I think comes from this idea that we don't have power or we don't have agency. So yeah, it felt really important for me to talk about that conversation, but whilst at the same time illuminating for young people that the things that we have in our lives and the way that we consume does, like, it is connected to other people across the world, and we are connected to the person who, you know, farm the cotton for the jumpers that we wear, and the person who weave that together into a material, and the person who sewed that together, and not like, it's not this kind of dichotomy or like there's not only two answers of it's just like changing your individual habits or it's just collective action. It's kind of, we need both of them together. And so I wanted to try and talk about that.
Nicholas, one of the things I recall from your book is an outgrowth of different ideas of how government should be responsible to its people in the wake of the climate shock that you write about. And I'm wondering how that squares for you with current conversations about climate justice. Oh, you're muted, Nicholas. You're still muted.
Thank you. I apologize. I guess this is just a variation on something Mikaela was saying earlier, but, we live in the imaginings of people from long ago. The structures that govern our lives are in, almost always things that, never had to be this way. It was one possible set of futures that we happen to have found our way toward. And what's interesting when you look back a couple of hundred years ago is you can kind of see people establishing those structures, right? You can see those thoughts being had. Sometimes you have a sinking feeling when you watch that happen. And sometimes, it can be a little bit inspirational. And one of the things that happens in the wake of the climate shock in my book is that governments start to, for really the very first time, take responsibility for what happens to a lot of their citizens. I mean, this is a time when, in a lot of places, it's still a very feudal time. The idea of kind of the nation state is pretty obscure. And so the idea that, governments owe their citizens something is not actually something that's taken for granted. And so when all of a sudden people are starving in the streets, when people are begging on every street corner, people start to conceive the idea that perhaps helping other people is what we should do in this sort of situation. And maybe that sounds like small comfort, but at the time, it was kind of a revolutionary idea. Not that long ago, I mean, it was agreed on by many philosophers that really what we needed to do was basically just, get rid of a lot of people, and that would solve a lot of the problems that we had. And so this is the very opposite of that thought. And I think it suggests that people can make choices, they can come to conclusions that aren't at all inevitable and that are surprising even to them. And, maybe we can take some solace from that.
Well, I want to give you a chance to chime in as well.
Those are hard answers to follow. So what I was thinking when I'm considering this question too is how important it is to listen to the people who were actually affected by our decision. It seems obvious, like talk to the people who are affected in this area, but obviously that doesn't happen. But for one, because it's the right thing to do, these people who live here are going to be affected by this decision. Consider how they're affected. Consider that, and also because that's where you're going to get the best information. You can't swoop in and think you know better than everyone who's lived here forever. They're going to know what about this land, about this say body of water, about this terrain, and about my inspiration for my setting. The indigenous people of the area, the Karankawas, knew you don't want to live here this time of year. There's a reason people are nomadic. It's not for fun. So they would know, okay, hurricane season is coming. It's time to move farther inland or time to move up the coast. So just listening to people who know more than we do, but I think it's hard for people to acknowledge sometimes that maybe others know better, and we should listen to them for their own good and for all of our sakes.
So sort of inherent in conversations about climate change is a conversation about climate anxiety, which I know a lot of kids today are feeling quite acutely. So how do you approach in your books or in your work in general, helping kids feel empowered to make a difference in their communities while also not feeling overwhelmed by responsibility? Lynn, would you like to start on this one?
Oh, sure. I was thinking this is something too that illustrates the power of a story, because again, it is overwhelming and there are so many issues going on. There's so many problems, and how do we tackle it? And what can I do? I'm just one person. But then these stories too show what our characters did. What are some decisions they made? Communities are so important right now, and that's where we can see the effects of what we do. And so these stories will show decisions our characters made for the good of others. Our readers will likely not go through the same things our characters do. Most of them are not going to find an injured animal. They might, and so if they come across it, they'll consider what to do. They'll hopefully feel more connected to that and feel some responsibility there. They're likely not going to try to save an entire beach of sea turtles and their eggs, but now they're aware of that issue and that there are things they can do, and they could follow up on that and see, what can I do to help that? I'm not near there, but what can I do to help? And seeing what other people do, and then thinking day to day, what can I do to make something better in my, again, in my community, with my family, my school, my friends, or the larger community. What steps can I take? So they do see examples in these stories of one person making a difference.
Nicholas, how about you?
I guess I would say that, I think part of my project in this book is sort of an act of thinking together with the reader. And I hope that what the reader takes away is not sort of, if they were someone who was experiencing climate anxiety before, not something that kind of deadens that feeling, but something that allows them new ways of kind of structuring it and thinking through it. And sometimes that's a remove that you can get from going back in time. And so it's a little bit of an unfair advantage, I think. It's much harder, to pull off the task that, Mikaela's doing, where you're writing about what's happening now, right? But I think sometimes by looking away and by seeing something that you've never heard about before, you can gain some sort of purchase and some sort of perspective on sort of the perils of the moment.
Mary, you are nodding a lot. What are your thoughts on this one?
I'm so inspired by everybody here. I just really appreciate being a part of this group. I think I'll just add that I have a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old. And when I was writing Turtles of the Midnight Moon, they were 10 and 12 or something. And one thing I will say is kids are really smart and you can't gaslight them. So they're going to feel anxious. They are online. They are on the TikToks and the YouTubes and all that stuff. And so for us as writers, for kids who are aware of what's going on and who are anxious about a lot of this stuff, I think acknowledging that, and almost like for me with Verana and Abby, they are anxious, not so much about, yes, about climate change, but also just being 12 and 13. You're gonna have so much anxiety anyway. And I think acknowledging it, naming it, and saying, yes, this is really hard. And just, I guess for me, making sure that anxiety doesn't become cynicism and well, nothing to do. So it's almost like you don't want to gaslight them, but you also want to steer them in the direction of action and hope. And one of the two main characters basically has to find the courage to speak out, right? And by the end of the story, she does. She's able to kind of call out what she's passionate about. And I think that's one thing that is important for kids to take away, is that whatever it may be, whether it's a particular creature or, you know, in your community, you're annoyed because the trash cans are overflowing and nobody's doing anything about it, whatever it may be, just that they can take action and not become so overwhelmed by everything that they're seeing out in the world and in the news.
Mhm. Mikaela, I'll give you the last word on this one. So this is basically the entire project of your book.
Yeah, fabulous. But I really want to echo everything that everyone's saying about like the importance of knowing that you can do something about it. I think is so important. I think this, so I wrote a piece for Brightly on climate anxiety and for Earth Month, for parents in particular, if people are interested, that goes into like some tips about a bit more. But I think that the biggest place that this anxiety comes from is this feeling like I can't do anything about this, or I don't fully understand this, and this feels really scary. I don't understand it, and I don't know what to do about it, and people around me won't talk to me about it properly. And when I go to schools and I ask kids, like, are you worried about the climate crisis? Almost every single hand goes up. Like they are aware of what's going on. Like kids know what's up, and I think we need to like meet young people with also like this like level of respect of like you're also a person who's in this world and you're going to inherit whatever our future is, and I'm going to like honor you with talking to you honestly about what's going on, and what you can do about it in like a practical way, and not in a way of like I still obviously I want kids to be able to be kids. Like I want kids to be silly and have fun and like play with their friends. I'm not expecting every kid to, you know, spend all day like organizing in meetings and going to conferences and all this other stuff. But I think if we give kids like tools that allow them to realize that they can change things, and also to realize that they're not the first kids to have done this. I was really intentional to put in examples in the book of how kids have organized around different issues, or how they have created change, and how they are doing that now, of, you know, indigenous kids in Ecuador who are taking like oil companies to court and are really involved in their future and their present. And so I felt really important in the book, like the kind of end part of the book, the last part is like quite practical advice of like, how do we do something with these emotions? Like we now know that we don't push them down, we don't get rid of them, but like what can we actually do? How can we look in our community and change things? And I think for me, that's the only thing that's ever stopped me feeling super, super anxious. Because as I said earlier, I'm like going through a lot of climate grief right now. And I'd actually say it's more grief than anxiety, in the sense that I do think I have an idea of what we can do and what we should do. I just feel sad that we haven't done enough, like so far. But the only thing when I'm feeling overwhelmed by grief in any way that helps me is this like knowledge that we have saved so much already, and that it's so much harder to quantify what hasn't happened rather than like what has. So whether it's the climate crisis, or whether it's, you know, seeing children be killed in Palestine, like I feel really overwhelmed by how big these issues are, and sometimes I feel like overwhelmed with the grief of how what we've done is inadequate in the face of it. But then I have to remind myself that if we hadn't have resisted these issues, if we hadn't spoken up in the way that we have, if we hadn't taken action, all of us, so much more would have been lost that we won't know. Like so much more harm would have been created. And so I think a reminder of what we have done, and that we won't ever fully know that, but that like to have some comfort in that also really helps with that anxiety. And then having some time exercising imagination still of like, what could a better world look like? How could we transform this world? And knowing that whatever happens, like whatever we can do to make the world even a little bit better, is so worth it always. So it's always worth doing.
Yeah. We are about out of time, but I want to ask one more question very quickly. You could tell me one thing that is giving you hope in the face of climate anxiety. Maria, can we start with you?
Oh my gosh, on the spot. What is giving me hope? Well, I'm gonna cheat and keep it easy because I can't think of anything right now. This, like talking to you guys, authors, writers, creatives, artists who are, you know, doing their part to make a difference.
Nicholas, how about you?
Well, I mean, I think it would be hard to, write anything for children if we weren't people who were sort of, incorrigibly hopeful in some way, right? And so, yeah, I think like, I think there's a tremendous amount that we can do, and we just have to have the will to do it. And I think, we should have kind of deep within us, I think, undiminished by the anxiety and the fear, the knowledge that, there is a path ahead. We just have to walk it.
Mm, yeah. Mikaela, how about you?
I think this space makes me feel very hopeful. Knowing that your books are out there in the world, in schools, in kids' bedrooms, like makes me feel hopeful in itself. And also I think what I'm really holding on to is this just reality that like even if we can't save everything, whatever we can save is always worth it. Like even if we can make one person's life better or safer or saved, that will always be worth it, and that we actually have the power to do that. We have that power within us, we have that power in our communities, that we are not like consigned to one future, that the future is actually the like conclusion of the story that we're all writing with our lives. And so it just is on us to write it and to love each other and to be driven by love, I think, and to remind ourselves of that we do this just because we care so deeply, and that's beautiful and that will always be worth it. So that's what gives me hope.
Mm. And Lynne, what's giving you hope?
For one thing, hearing about the kids who are doing the work, like the examples Mikaela gave about kids who are taking action and recognizing this is a problem. There are problems out there, and we can do something about it. We can take some steps to address those. So seeing kids who care about these issues and seeing anyone who's doing the work to make the world better. It's so discouraging to see the damage that we humans have done. But then I'm encouraged to see people who are working against that and working to make the world better. We have the capacity to do such wonderful things and to make the world a better place. So seeing the work that people do, whether it's in a small, say, wildlife rescue, helping the animals in their community who are injured, who need help, or on a broader scale, trying to save entire species from diminishing their populations, or educating people, putting the word out there about the problems that are in the world and steps that we can take to address those gives me some hope.
Thank you all so much for this wonderful, generous conversation. It's been such a pleasure to talk to all of you about your books and to hear about your thinking behind them. Thank you so much for being here today. Tomorrow, all attendees will receive an email containing links to a certificate of completion and video recording. For more about Booklist webinars, be sure to visit www.booklistonline.com/webinars, where you can view archives of past webinars and register for upcoming ones like those you see here. You can also find out about the latest webinars on our social channels. Visit us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and now Blue Sky. Just a note, we are no longer on X, so please find us on these other channels for the latest Booklist news and updates. We are thrilled to announce that the digital version of Booklist Reader, the monthly readers advisory magazine from the editors of Booklist, is now an ALA member benefit. Head over to our new updated site to start reading. And if you're not already a Booklist subscriber, you can use your ALA membership ID to sign up. Thank you again for joining us for today's wonderful webinar. And one more huge thank you to our panelists and to our sponsor, Random House Children's Book. This concludes today's webinar. See you next time.